The Ossuary Bloom. Chapter 3. The Dissonant Chord. The air in Aris's quarters was a thick, syrupy cocktail of scents. The cloying sweetness of recycled nutrients from the vents, the metallic tang of old water, and the sharp ozone tang of an overworked processing core. It was the smell of a tomb, and tonight he was its sole obsessive occupant. The only light came from a sprawling holographic display, its cold blue glow painting his face in haggard strokes and casting long skeletal shadows against the gothic curve of the far wall. Piles of data slates and discarded synth protein wrappers formed crumbling monuments to his neglect. On the display, the same 12 seconds of corrupted footage looped. Again. And again. It was a pirated feed, scavenged from a public servitor's maintenance log during the suppression event in the Ossuary. Most of it was useless, a maelstrom of digital snow and screaming audio artifacts as the architect's counter-resonance pulse had washed over the level. But in the chaos, Aris had found a crack. A handful of frames where the servitor's optical sensor, shielded by a bulkhead for a split second, had captured a slice of the scene. The image resolved. 2 figures in the sterile white and gold armor of the architects of silence. They moved with an inhuman precision, their pulse rifles not aimed at a person but at the very air, firing beams of disruptive energy that made reality seem to fray at the edges. They were erasing the echo, sanitizing the memory. Then the playback stuttered. The image dissolved into a waterfall of green and purple pixels. Static hissed from the speakers like a nest of angry serpents. "Come on," Aris muttered, his voice a dry rasp. His fingers danced over the control surface, a worn-out haptic board that barely registered his touch anymore. He rewound the feed, frame by agonizing frame. The static receded. The architects reappeared. He pushed forward. There, in the far left periphery, almost swallowed by the long shadow of a cryogenic pod bank. A shape. A man. Aris's breath hitched. He isolated the coordinates, magnifying the section until the image degraded into a mosaic of blurry squares. He engaged the isobaric filters, trying to sharpen the contrast, to pull a face from the noise. The processor of his custom rig whined in protest, its fans kicking into a desperate, high-pitched hum. The ozone smell intensified.
For a moment, the filters caught, the squares coalesced. He saw a man, wiry and clad in the patched utilitarian garb of a rust garden scavenger. His face was gaunt, bearded, etched with the grim resolve of someone who lived life on the station's frayed edge. And his eyes, even in the grainy reconstruction, his eyes were wide, fixed on the suppression team. Not with fear, but with a scavenger's predatory focus. Then the man's gaze darted down. Aris tracked the movement, his own eyes straining. Something small and dark had fallen, skittering from the belt of one of the architects as they moved. A data chip. It was almost invisible against the grimy deck plating. The scavenger moved like a rat in the walls, a fluid, economic scuttle. He scooped up the chip, his movements practiced and swift, and then melted back into the deeper shadows of the ossuary. A ghost. Then the corruption wave hit the feed again, and the man, the chip, the entire moment was annihilated in a burst of white noise. Aris leaned back, the synth leather of his chair groaning in protest. He rubbed his temples, the phantom pressure of a headache building behind his eyes. Frustration was a coppery taste in his mouth. This was the 20th time he had isolated the sequence. The 20th time he had tried a different algorithmic reconstruction. The result was always the same: a fleeting glimpse, a ghost story told in broken data, a ghost who had seen it all, a ghost who held a piece of it in his hand. He had to find him. The thought wasn't a wish, it was a physical need, a gnawing imperative that had taken root in the hollow space Lyra's death had left behind. The echo he had witnessed in the ossuary, the way its shimmering form had almost, for a breath, resembled her, was not just a scientific anomaly. It was a sign, a second chance he didn't deserve but had to seize.
"No more ghosts," he said aloud, the words sounding alien in the quiet room. The frustration curdled, then hardened into something else, something cold and sharp. Determination. He couldn't pull a clean biometric signature from the recording. The architect's signal jammers had seen to that. He couldn't flag the man on the station's internal census. He had no name, no identification number, just a grainy picture and the knowledge that he was a scavenger, a dreg from the rust gardens, which was enough. It had to be. He stood, his joints cracking in protest. The holographic image of the scavenger, frozen in the moment before he vanished, remained suspended in the air. The man's face was a promise of answers, a map to the heart of the conspiracy he could feel tightening around Ethelgard like a noose. Aris turned from the display and moved to a large, corroded footlocker in the corner of the room. The clasps hissed open, releasing the faint smell of machine oil and ozone-scrubbed fabric. This was his old field kit, from a life before disgrace, before Ethelgard became his gilded cage. He pulled out a heavy canvas roll and spread it on his cluttered work table. Polished metal tools gleamed dully in the blue light. A portable spectrographic scanner, a master data spike for interfacing with non-standard ports, a kinetic multi-tool. He added a compact med injector and 2 dense, foil-wrapped ration bars. This wasn't a lab expedition. This was a hunt. He slid a thin, flexible data pad into a pocket of his jacket, uploading the looped recording and the single stabilized image of the scavenger's face. His ghost, his guide. Before closing the footlocker, his fingers brushed against a small, velvet-lined case. He hesitated, his jaw tight. He opened it. Inside lay a single, antique data chip, its casing made of polished obsidian. It held the only unharmonized, unredacted recording of Lyra's voice he still possessed. A contraband memory, his most dangerous and precious belonging. He almost took it with him, a talisman against the station's oppressive stillness. But no. That's what you're trying to earn back. He closed the case, the click echoing with a grim finality. He couldn't take her with him. Not this time. This time, he had to go out into the decay and the lies and find the truth he had been hiding from. He looked back at the hologram one last time. The scavenger's face, a mask of grim opportunity. Aris finally had a direction. Down. Down into the filth and rust to find a man who shouldn't exist, who was holding a secret that could get them both killed. The frustration was gone, burned away by the cold fire of obsession. He was no longer just a disgraced scientist in a locked room. He was a hunter, and his prey was a memory.
The air in the sanctum was a perfect, manufactured void. It held no dust, no stray humidity, no scent save for the clean, sharp tang of ozone from the silent air purifiers, and the faintest undertone of something sterile, like chilled formaldehyde carried on a ghost current from the ossuary levels far below. The Sparalerian stood at the precise geometric center of the obsidian floor, her reflection a sharp, gray-clad distortion in the polished dark. Here, in the command spire of the architects of silence, sound did not echo. It was absorbed, smothered by the sound-dampening panels that formed the chamber's stark, angled walls. The only noise was the subliminal hum of Ethelgard itself, a bass note felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was the sound of the great stillness, the ultimate good, and Vespera had trained her entire life to find peace within it. She kept her posture immaculate, her hands clasped behind her back. Her gaze was fixed on the far wall, where a single, hair-thin line of cool blue light bisected the darkness, the chamber's only illumination. She had been standing here for 17 minutes. Patience was not a virtue among the architects. It was a baseline requirement as fundamental as breathing. To be summoned to the sanctum was a rare and significant event. It meant one had been chosen for a task of critical importance to the preservation of order. It was an honor. Yet beneath the placid surface of her discipline, a single, dissonant thought pulsed with quiet persistence. Why me?
A section of the wall to her left shimmered, resolving from flat black into a doorway of liquid shadow. A figure emerged, and the door flowed shut behind him, leaving no trace it had ever been there. Senior architect Corvus moved with a liquid grace that belied his age, his long gray robes making no sound against the floor. His face was a mask of serene neutrality, the skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, his eyes dark and placid as undisturbed water. He stopped 10 paces from her, his presence a sudden, immense pressure in the sterile air. "Technician Lyrian," he said. His voice was a calm, resonant monotone, each word perfectly spaced, the sound of a machine achieving its ideal function. "Stillness upon you." "And upon you, senior architect," Vespera replied, her own voice a practiced, steady cadence. She inclined her head a precise 15 degrees, no more, no less. "We have observed a deviation," Corvus stated, getting directly to the point. Emotion was a waste of energy. "A minor but persistent anomaly requiring clarification." He raised a hand, and the air between them flickered. A holographic file materialized, a spinning lattice of light and data. At its center was a low-resolution capture of a man's face. It was haggard, shadowed with exhaustion and something more, a profound, soul-deep weariness. His eyes, even in the grainy image, seemed to burn with a feverish intensity. Vespera's training took over, her mind accessing and cross-referencing the facial data with cold efficiency. Dr. Aris Thorne, xenobiologist, disgraced. Specialty, neural mapping, extinct alien species. Service record, flagged for psychological instability following the Xylos expedition incident. Accidental death of spouse, Dr. Lyra Thorne. Subject placed on restricted duty, confined to archival work, considered echo-lost by his peers. The information flowed through her mind, clean and detached. "Dr. Thorne," Corvus continued, his gaze never leaving her face, as if he were reading the data from her own thoughts. "His recent patterns of activity have diverged from established norms. He has accessed ossuary-level schematics.
He has made unauthorized inquiries into resonance event logs. Trivialities on their own, but a pattern of trivialities can form a mosaic of disruption.
Resonance. The word hung in the air, a discordant note in the sanctum's perfect quiet. The official doctrine was clear. Resonance was a symptom of decay, a ghost in the station's aging machinery. Random neural firings from the biostorage pods, amplified by failing systems. They were glitches, meaningless and chaotic. To show interest in them was to invite that same chaos into one's own mind. The doctor's obsession is a potential vector for emotional contagion, Corvus said, a threat to the great stillness, a weed that must be observed before it is pulled. Obsession, Vespera thought. The word was precise. Thorne's file was saturated with it. His pursuit of knowledge had led to the Xylos disaster, to his wife's death. He was a cautionary tale taught to junior technicians, the inevitable end state of unchecked ambition. And yet, the architects were focusing the gaze of a senior member and a dedicated technician on him. It felt disproportionate, like using a fusion cutter to trim a fingernail. Your task is to become his shadow technician, Corvus stated. You will monitor his communications, his movements, his queries. You will attach a passive neural tracer to his network access. You will be the leash that keeps this stray animal from wandering into the gears of the station. You will report every deviation, no matter how minor. You will not engage. You will not interfere. You will only watch. I understand, Senior Architect. Her voice did not waver. Her face remained a mask of disciplined loyalty. Inside, however, the gears of her own mind were turning. The Xylos expedition data was heavily redacted, even for most architects. The official story was an equipment malfunction during a neural mapping procedure. But the word on the lower levels, the whispers in the dark corridors of Viridia Spire, told a different story. A story of something found, something that broke him. This assignment requires discretion. Corvus's voice lowered, a near whisper that was somehow more commanding than a shout. The nature of our interest in Dr. Thorne must remain within this chamber. To the station, he is a man lost in memory, a harmless ghost. We must know if that is all he is.
Corvus's dark eyes seemed to pierce through her composure, searching for any flicker of doubt, any hint of the questions churning beneath her placid exterior. Why not simply harmonize him, wipe the anomalous thoughts, restore him to a state of placid productivity? It is the standard protocol for ideological divergence. The question was a dangerous one, a violation in its own right, and she pushed it down with years of practiced mental discipline. But it did not vanish. It settled, a cold, heavy stone in her gut. Your service to the stillness has been exemplary, Vespera, Corvus said, the use of her first name a rare and calculated tool. It was meant to reinforce loyalty, to create a bond of personal responsibility. You understand the sanctity of order. You appreciate the necessity of control. That is why you are chosen. He was right. She did. She believed in the great stillness with the entirety of her being. The chaos of raw, unfiltered emotion, the grief, the rage, the obsessive love that had destroyed Aris Thorne, was a disease.
the architects were the cure. This was the foundational truth of her world. To question it was unthinkable. And yet, the assignment still felt wrong. It was a piece that didn't fit the puzzle. The architects did not observe weeds. They burned them from the garden. To watch Thorn, to let him continue his obsessive quest, suggested they were interested not just in what he was doing, but in what he might find. A quiet suspicion, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, began to form in the carefully ordered stillness of her mind. "I will not fail," she said, her voice absolute. It was the only answer possible. "See that you do not," Corvus replied. The hologram of Aris Thorn dissolved into motes of light. "The necessary clearance and surveillance tools have been uploaded to your personal datapad. Begin immediately." With another nod, Vespera turned and walked toward the wall she had entered through. It shimmered open for her, a silent invitation back into the station's dim, humming corridors. As she stepped through, the perfect silence of the sanctum was replaced by the familiar, low thrum of Ethelgard. The cloying sweetness of recycled air and nutrient paste filled her lungs.
The door sealed behind her, and she was alone in the empty vaulted hallway. For a moment she stood perfectly still, the mask of the obedient technician still firmly in place. But her eyes, now reflecting the flickering neon of a distant advertisement, held a new light, an analytical glimmer. An assignment to watch a broken man, and order to stand by while he courted the chaos of resonance. It was not just a leash, it was a test. Not just of Thorn's stability, but of hers. And Vespera Lyrian had never failed a test in her life. The air in Hraldar Brekker's workshop tasted of rust and wet soil, a thick, humid cocktail that clung to the back of the throat. It was the perpetual breath of the rust gardens, a miasma of decay that had long since seeped into his clothes, his skin, his very bones. Outside, the sprawling hydroponic farms and recycling vats groaned under the strain of a century and a half of neglect, their metallic skeletons weeping streams of algae-green condensation. Here, in his cramped sanctuary carved from a decommissioned maintenance conduit, the only light came from a single jury-rigged luminous strip that cast a jaundiced glow over a workbench, drowning in tools, tangled wires, and the ghosts of 1,000 failed projects. Patches of pale blue bioluminescent fungi crept up the curved walls, their ethereal light painting the corroded metal in shifting patterns, like a slow-motion constellation of rot. Hraldar ignored them. His entire world had shrunk to the 5 centimeters of obsidian-black material resting in the diagnostic cradle of his makeshift decryption deck. The data chip. A perfect, seamless shard of architect-grade tech, so far beyond the salvaged junk he normally dealt with, it felt like an artifact from another universe. He ran a calloused thumb over its unnervingly smooth surface. He'd plucked it from the grime of an ossuary service corridor, a tiny jewel dropped in the wake of the architect's brutal suppression squad. A mistake. A priceless, impossible mistake. And for the last 3 cycles, it had been his obsession and his torment.
His deck, a Frankenstein's monster of scavenged motherboards and bypassed power couplings, whirred and clicked, its tiny fan fighting a losing battle against the oppressive humidity. On the cracked data slate he used as a monitor, strings of corrupted hex code scrolled past in a waterfall of amber gibberish. He'd been trying to brute force the encryption with a suite of black market icebreakers, each one failing more spectacularly than the last. He leaned back, the protesting screech of his chair lost in the constant low hum of the station's failing circulatory system. This was useless. It was like trying to pick a plasma-sealed lock with a bent piece of wire. The chip wasn't just locked, it was hostile. Every time his software tried to find a purchase, the chip's internal security responded with a surge of junk data that threatened to fry his entire setup. He thought of the look on the architect's face, the one who dropped it. The sterile white uniform, the impassive mask, and then a flicker of... what? Panic? Annoyance? It was gone in an instant, but Rodar had built a life on noticing such things. The flicker was why he'd risked circling back. An architect's panic was a commodity more valuable than any ration chit or echo. But what good was it if he couldn't even read the damn thing? Another stream of error messages filled the screen, a series of taunting red sigils. "Stillness upon you," he muttered, the official greeting dripping with a thick layer of sarcasm that was purely his own. Right. The great stillness. The tranquility the architects preached from their gilded spires while the dregs down here in the gardens breathed in slow poison from the leaking reactor they pretended didn't exist. The same slow poison that had stolen his Alara from him year by agonizing year, leaving him with nothing but a hollowed-out ache and a deep, abiding hatred for the pristine lies of the upper levels. He jabbed a finger at a command prompt, rerouting his last decryption algorithm through a chaotic state filter he designed to crack corporate security on salvaged cargo manifests. It was a sledgehammer approach. Reckless. It would either work or turn the priceless chip into a piece of fused slag. For a moment, nothing. Then the screen flickered. The waterfall of code stopped. It resolved. Not into text, but into an image. A schematic. It bloomed into life for a bare second, a lattice of impossibly fine glowing lines. It wasn't a machine, not in any way Haroldar recognized. It looked organic, a web of interconnected nodes that resembled a neural map, but on a scale that made his stomach clench. It was vast, alien, a circuit diagram for a living god. He saw something that looked like the cryogenic pods of the ossuary, but they were cross-sectioned, and the lines of light plunged directly into the outlines of the human forms within, branching like roots in dead soil. His breath caught in his chest. He leaned forward, trying to burn the image into his memory, his scavenger's brain already trying to calculate its meaning, its value. Then it was gone. The screen dissolved back into a chaotic scramble of red error text, more aggressive this time, and his deck emitted a sharp, angry buzz. The chip had pushed back, hard. He slumped in his chair, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. That wasn't a system glitch. That wasn't a fragment of a cargo manifest. It was a secret, a deep, foundational secret. He felt it in his gut, the same instinct that told him when a support beam was about to fail, or when a rival scavenger was about to make a move. He was holding a key, but he had no idea what door it opened. He only knew the people on the other side were watching. And that's when he heard it. Scream! The sound cut through the ambient hum of the station like a shard of glass. It wasn't the rhythmic drip of condensation or the distant mournful clang of a maintenance drone. It was the sharp, deliberate scrape of a heavy boot on the corroded metal walkway just outside his hidden doorway. Instantly, the frustrated tinkerer vanished. Harolder's body went rigid, every muscle coiled, his focus narrowed to a single point of pure predatory awareness. He stabbed a kill switch beneath the bench, and the luminostrip, the deck, and the monitor all died at once, plunging the workshop into the near-total darkness of the rust gardens, save for the faint ghostly blue of the fungi. His hand moved without thought, bypassing the scattered tools and closing around the worn grip of the weapon that was always within reach. A slugger, a length of dense lead-weighted pipe, capped with a salvaged pneumatic piston. It had no finesse, but it could shatter bone and dent reinforced plating. In the dark, it was an extension of his will.
He rose from his chair without a sound, his worn boots making no purchase on the grimy floor. He was a shadow moving through shadows, his breathing slowing to a shallow, controlled rhythm. He slid along the wall, the cold, damp metal a familiar caress against his back. The station's groans seemed to amplify in the silence, each one a potential footstep, each drip a potential threat. He reached the doorway, a crude plate of sheet metal he'd rigged into place years ago. He pressed his ear against it, listening past the frantic pounding of his own heart. Was it an architect patrol? They rarely came this deep unless they were hunting someone. Another scavenger drawn by the flicker of his unsanctioned tech, or just some echo-lost dreg who'd wandered off the main path. He heard nothing more, only the station sighing its long, slow death rattle around him. But the silence was worse than the sound had been. It was a loaded silence, a held breath. His paranoia, the trait that had kept him alive while so many others had ended up as nutrient paste or entries in the ossuary, was screaming at him. "Come on, you bastards." He waited, motionless, the slugger held tight in a white-knuckled grip. The weight of the data chip in his pocket suddenly felt immense, a small, cold stone that promised not wealth or leverage, but a grave. The frustration was gone. This was the real world, a world of predators and prey, of secrets that kill, and of deep, dark places where a single noise could be the last thing you ever heard. The gantry vibrated with the station's agonal hum, a deep thrum that traveled from the soles of Vespera's soft-soled boots and settled in her teeth. 20 meters below, the service tunnels of the lower spire sprawled like the fossilized guts of some colossal beast. Here, the air lost its sterile, recycled quality. It was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone from sparking conduits, the damp earth smell of encroaching bioluminescent fungi, and a cloying sweetness that hinted at the rust garden's distant metabolic decay. Stillness upon you. The greeting was a prayer, a mantra, a fundamental law. Here, in the station's forgotten arteries, that law felt thin.
From her perch in the web of corroded steel, she watched him. Dr. Aris Thorne, a flicker of motion in a world of gray inertia. He was just a shape in the gloom, haloed by the erratic pulse of an emergency strip light. But on the data pads thrust to her forearm, he was a composite of a dozen different angles. A high-angle shot from a grime-caked dome camera, a heat signature from a passive sensor, a predictive pathing overlay rendered in a line of pale gold. The architect-level override gave her a god's-eye view, a privilege earned through a lifetime of unwavering discipline. Her movements were a study in silence. Each step was placed on the gantry's solid crossbeams, avoiding the rusted mesh that would groan under her weight. Her dark, non-reflective synthofabric uniform drank the sparse light. She was an absence, a patch of deeper shadow in the darkness. This was routine, an individual flagged for emotional deviancy after the minor resonance event in Ossuary 7. Her task was simple: observe, report, and if necessary, contain. Thorne was a data point, another frayed nerve in Ethelgard's psyche that required calming. She expected to see a man adrift, someone lost tracing the patterns of his grief through the station's neglected corridors, an echo lost in the making. But Thorn wasn't drifting. He moved with a clipped, agitated purpose. He bypassed the main, better-lit concourses, ducking into a maintenance bypass she knew from the schematics was prone to atmospheric leaks. Her predictive pathing algorithm flickered, recalculating with a frantic cascade of golden lines. It was struggling to keep up. Confidence was the default state of an architect. It was the natural result of knowing you held all the variables. Vespera felt the first, unwelcome tremor in that foundation. A glob of viscous condensation fell from a pipe above her, missing her shoulder by a centimeter and landing on a sheet of loose plasteel below with a loud smack. Thorn froze. Vespera's breath caught in her throat. She flattened herself against a bulkhead, every muscle tensed. Below, Thorn scanned the darkness, his head tilted. His posture wasn't one of fear. It was one of a hunter who has heard a twig snap. After a long moment, he moved on. The incident was a reminder. The environment here was a hostile variable in itself. She pulled up his file again, the text glowing pale blue in the dark. Dr. Aris Thorn, xenobiologist, neuromapping specialist, disgraced. She scrolled past his list of published works, his accolades from a life before Ethelgard. Her finger hovered over the addendum. Incident report, Xylos expedition. Subject, Dr. Lyra Thorn. Status, deceased. Cause, accidental atmospheric decompression. Aris Thorn's culpability, indirect, resulting from procedural negligence driven by obsessive focus. Obsession. It was the most dangerous of all emotional corruptions, the antithesis of the great stillness. It didn't lead to aimless wandering. It forged a path. And Thorn's path was leading him deeper down, away from the relative order of the technocrat levels, past the last official markers of Viridia Spire, and toward the septic systems that fed the rust gardens. The scent of decay intensified. A thick vegetative rot but clung to the back of her throat. This was not the territory of a scientist. This was the domain of dregs. Her datapad chirped softly, a proximity alert. A lumbering M7 maintenance drone was making its rounds on the level below, its optical sensors sweeping the tunnel in sterile blue arcs. It was on a direct intercept course with Thorn. Standard procedure would be for the drone to scan him, log his unauthorized presence, and send a low-priority alert. Vespera prepared to observe his reaction. But Thorn did something impossible. Just before reaching the intersection, he ducked into a narrow, unlit power conduit access that wasn't even on her public-facing schematics. He flattened himself inside, disappearing from sight a full 10 seconds before the drone rumbled past. The cool, analytical detachment she had been trained to embody was failing her. This place was a testament to failure. Rusted metal, failing light, the stink of organic processes running unchecked. It was chaos, an insult to the pristine, ordered world the architects had curated. And Thorn was navigating it not as an intruder, but as if he was returning to a familiar squalor. Her unease curdled into something bordering on disgust. She followed, her movements now more cautious, more predatory. He was no longer just a subject to be observed. He was an adversary. He finally emerged into a slightly wider cavern, a nexus of crumbling tunnels lit by the sickly green glow of phosphorescent moss. A disused water reclamation cistern dominated the center of the space. Thorne stopped. He leaned against the cistern's curved wall, his shoulders slumped, but his head was up, scanning the oppressive darkness. He was waiting. Vespera held her position, concealed behind a massive defunct ventilation fan. She magnified her view, the optical implant in her right eye painting Thorne's outline in crisp detail. The silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the gloom. Her training screamed at her. This was wrong. This was a rendezvous. A simple case of emotional surveillance had escalated into something far more dangerous. A conspiracy. As if summoned by the thought, a second figure detached itself from the shadows. Shorter than Thorne, broader, wrapped in the patched utilitarian gear of a rust garden scavenger. A dreg. The figure moved with a survivor's economy, a stark contrast to Thorne's agitated energy. Vespera didn't need a file to know his kind. Hroldar Brecker, a name that occasionally surfaced in low-level reports on black market activity. A ghost. She couldn't hear their words, but their body language was a language she understood perfectly. Thorne, tense and desperate. Brecker, wary and cynical. She watched as the scavenger produced a small object from his pocket, a data chip. It glinted once in the green light as he passed it to Thorne. A transaction. Information. Forbidden knowledge. Her unease vanished, replaced by the cold certainty she had craved. The situation was no longer ambiguous. The variable was not just deviating, it was colluding. The sickness was spreading. Her mission parameters shifted instantly, from observation to containment. The gentle hand of the harmonizer was no longer sufficient. This required a scalpel. The service corridor ended not with a door, but a wound. A jagged, makeshift wall of welded scrap and scavenged plating plugged the grand archway that once led to the rust gardens. The original blast doors were still there, recessed and inert, their surfaces scarred with plasma cutter marks where someone had long ago given up trying to force them. The new barrier was a monument to desperation. A chaotic mosaic of dented deck plates, twisted support beams, and panels ripped from defunct maintenance drones, all fused together with angry, bubbling weld seams. Official warnings, stamped in the severe, sterile font of the architects, were plastered across the metal. Danger, decommissioned zone, unstable atmosphere, high-level radionuclide contamination. But they were almost entirely obscured by a second, more vibrant layer of communication. Crude graffiti painted in bioluminescent pigments scrawled defiant messages over the official text. One skull and crossbones grinned with hollow eyes, a single word spray-painted beneath it, "Welcome." Another tag depicted a stylized architect figure being consumed by twisting vines, the paint glowing with a sickly green light. "Stillness upon you?" a sarcastic scrawl asked, the letters dripping like poison. "Here there is only rot."
Aris felt the station's two worlds pressing against each other at this very point. Behind him was the oppressive, ordered decay of Viridia, the familiar hum of the life support, the faint cloying scent of ozone and recycled water that clung to everything like a shroud. Ahead, seeping through the gaps in the barricade, was something else entirely, a different kind of decay. It was a thick, humid smell, earthy and wet,
carrying the cloying sweetness of aggressive decomposition and a sharp metallic undertone that made the fillings in his teeth ache. He pulled the enviromonitor from his coat pocket. The small device, a relic from his xenobiology field kit, whirred to life, its screen casting a pale blue light on his face. He held it up to a fist-sized gap in the junk wall. Immediately, the digital needle on the rad counter flickered, then jumped. A low, static crackle emitted from the monitor's speaker, a sound like frying insects. It wasn't a fatal dose, not immediately anyway, but it was a steady, persistent poison, a promise of a slow unraveling. The air quality index was a mess of amber and red warnings, high particulate matter, fungal spores, and unknown biological agents. Turn back. The thought was a whisper of self-preservation, a programmed echo of the great stillness he'd been taught to revere. There is no sense in this, no order. This is a path to oblivion, a place for the echo-lost and the desperate. The dregs who lived in this filth were said to be half-mad from the radiation and the isolation, trading scavenged parts for nutrient paste and authentic memories on the black market. But then he saw her. Not really, but in the fault line of his own memory, the image burned behind his eyes. Lyra. Not the warm, laughing Lyra who smelled of lab solvents and synth coffee, but the thing in the ossuary pod, the echo. The pale, translucent face, the eyes, her eyes opening, the subtle, impossible twitch of a finger, a ghost of a gesture that was so uniquely hers it had pierced him like a shard of glass. It wasn't a glitch. The architects, with their brutalist suppression teams and their sterile explanations, were lying. It was something more, something new. And if a scavenger had been lurking in the shadows of the ossuary during the event, if they had seen something, pocketed a dropped data chip, or simply witnessed it from an angle the official censors missed, the risk was justified.
His guilt was a fuel that burned hotter than any reactor. It was his obsession that led to Lyra's death on that barren moon, his pursuit of discovery at the cost of her safety. Now that same obsession demanded he follow this ghost, even if it led him into a tomb. The sound was lost in the corridor's hum. He holstered the monitor. His resolve hardened, calcifying his fear into a grim purpose. He wasn't seeking redemption anymore, not really. He was seeking an explanation, an answer that might give form to the guilt that haunted his every waking moment. He found the gap the graffiti artist had probably used, a narrow sliver near the floor, where a maintenance conduit had been ripped out, leaving a space barely wider than his shoulders. He dropped to his knees, the rough deck plating cold and gritty against his trousers. The air gusting from the opening was a physical presence, heavy and wet. It smelled like a grave dug in wet soil. He pushed his satchel through first, then followed, squeezing himself into the tight space. The sharp edge of a rusted plate snagged the fabric of his coat, holding him fast. For a panic moment, he was trapped, halfway between worlds. He grunted, twisting his body, feeling the cheap material tear with a sharp rip. The sound was unnervingly loud. He froze, listening. Nothing but the station's distant groans. He pushed again, scraping his shoulder against corroded metal. And then he was through, tumbling onto a floor slick with algae and grime. He landed on his hands and knees and immediately recoiled. The surface was soft, yielding, not metal. He looked down. He was kneeling in a thick carpet of rust-colored moss, glowing faintly with its own internal light. The air was thick enough to taste.
It coated his tongue with the flavor of copper and wet leaves. He coughed, the sound muffled in the heavy atmosphere. This was a different planet. The Gothic architecture of the station's spine was gone, replaced by a sprawling, chaotic jungle of industry. Towering hydroponic racks, long since gone dark, stood like skeletal trees, draped in thick cable-like vines. Corroded metal walkways crisscrossed over a chasm of darkness, their surfaces treacherous with slime. Water, thick with contaminants, dripped from enormous weeping pipes overhead, each drop landing with a heavy, echoing splash in the unseen depths below.
And the sound, the silence, was the most terrifying part. The constant, reassuring hum of Eithilgard's heart was gone. In its place was the groan of metal under stress, the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of toxic condensation, and the incessant, almost subliminal crackle of the radiation that was now soaking into his bones. His monitor, still clipped to his belt, was a quiet metronome counting down his future. He got to his feet, wiping his damp hands on his torn coat. He looked back at the barricade. The sliver of clean, blue-white light from the service corridor seemed impossibly far away, a memory of a cleaner, safer reality. Here, the only light came from patches of eerie, bioluminescent fungi that pulsed with a slow, blue-green rhythm, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. He was an intruder here, a void-born in a land of ghosts. Lyra. Her name was a prayer against the oppressive dark. Taking a breath that did nothing to fill his lungs, he took his first, tentative step onto a groaning metal gantry. It swayed beneath his weight, a complaint from a dying beast. He had crossed the threshold. Now he just had to survive what lay beyond it. The bulk had hissed open, a pneumatic sigh of weary metal, and then Aris Thorn was gone. He didn't look back. He simply stepped across the threshold and was swallowed by the gloom, his silhouette dissolving into the oppressive humidity of the rust gardens, as if he were made of smoke. Vespera remained rooted to the spot, a pale statue in the sterile blue-gray light of the Viridia access corridor. One step forward, and she would cross the line. The demarcation was not merely architectural, it was ideological. Behind her lay the ordered, if decaying, world of Eithilgard, a place of recycled air, polished decking, and regulated stillness. Ahead lay its antithesis, chaos. The air that billowed out to meet her was an assault. It was thick, wet, and complex. Not the clean metallic tang of ozone and antiseptic that clung to the ossuary, but a living stench. It smelled of damp earth and sweet, cloying rot, the perfume of a billion microscopic deaths. Beneath that was the sharp, ferrous bite of corrosion, so profound it seemed to have seeped into the very atmosphere, and a low, cloying sweetness like overripe fruit left to fester in the dark. The air didn't just enter her lungs, it coated them, a viscous film of decay. Her training, her entire existence had conditioned her to recognize this as contamination, a failure state, an environment to be purged, sealed, and forgotten. She watched the space where Aris had vanished. He hadn't hesitated. Of course he hadn't. He was a creature of chaos, a walking breach in the dam of tranquility the architects had so meticulously constructed. A man whose grief was a resonance event unto itself. Now he was her compass, pointing the way toward a truth she was no longer certain she wanted to find. The irony was a bitter acid in her throat. Her eyes scanned the entrance.
The Gothic arches that defined the station's aesthetic were still present, but here they were skeletal, stripped of all grandeur. Rivers of rust in shades of burnt umber and angry ochre bled down the walls from weeping bolts. Metal gratings underfoot were slick with a film of algae, glowing with a faint, sickly bioluminescence that pulsed in time with some unseen, faltering power cycle. A constant, rhythmic drip, drip, drip echoed from somewhere deep within, a water clock counting down the seconds to total collapse. The hum was different here, too. Not the stable thrum of life support, but the groaning, irregular labor of hydroponic pumps struggling against clogs and corrosion. It was the sound of a body shutting down. This was a place her order had written off, a lost cause. The official designation was entropy dominant, a sterile clinical term for a wound left to fester. The dregs who lived here were considered little more than ghosts, their memories too fragmented, their lives too disorderly to be worth harmonizing. They were simply allowed to fade, consumed by the station's slow decay. To an architect, entering the rust gardens was an admission of defeat. It was stepping off the path of control and onto the soil of surrender. Her hand, of its own volition, rose to the pristine white fabric of her uniform jacket. The material was smooth, sterile, perfect, a symbol of her station, her purpose. The thought of the grime, the rust-laced condensation, the shimmering spores that danced in the air, the thought of them touching this uniform, staining it, was viscerally repulsive. It felt like a physical violation. But then, another memory superimposed itself over the scene. The harmonization chamber. The clean, sterile white of the room, the controlled hum of the machine. The face of Lyra Thorne, a ghost made of light, her features suddenly twisting into a mask of confusion. And then the voice. Not hers. An old man's voice, cracking with age and static, clawing its way out of an echo that did not belong to it. Caelan. Her grandfather. The name, a secret buried so deep she had almost forgotten it, now a weapon turned against her. The echo, wearing Thorne's wife, speaking with her grandfather's voice, had spoken of experiments, of screams in the dark on a world they were never meant to touch. The official records, the sacred, immutable records she had dedicated her life to upholding, stated he had died peacefully, his consciousness subsumed into the great stillness, a model architect to the very end. A lie. It was all a lie. The sterile white of the harmonization chamber was the true filth. The polished surfaces of the architect enclaves were the true corrosion. This place, the rust gardens, in its open, honest decay, was purer than the world she had left behind. The rot here was on the surface for all to see. The rot she served had been hidden in the heart of everything she believed. The conflict inside her was a dissonant chord, a grinding of incompatible truths. Her duty, her new duty, was to follow Thorne, to find the foundational archive and uncover the scope of this lie. But her instincts, honed by 2 decades of indoctrination, screamed at her to retreat, to return to the clean, quiet corridors and the illusion of order. To be Vespera Lyrian, technician of the architects of silence, a name that now felt like a costume. She looked down at her polished black boots, reflecting the faint, pulsing green of the fungi. 1 step. That's all it would take. One step to betray her entire life. One step toward a truth that might be more monstrous than any lie. Her breath came out in a cloud of condensation, a ghost of the air from the clean world now dissipating into the filth. She would not be a keeper of a corrupted stillness. She would be an agent of a terrible truth. The anger from the chamber, cold and sharp, finally burned through the paralysis of her training. She took the step. Her boot met the grimy deck plate with a wet, sucking sound that made her flinch. The perfect polish was gone, instantly marred by a smear of greenish-brown slime. She felt the contamination spread up her leg, a phantom sensation, an ideological stain. The air was heavier on this side of the threshold, the smell of decay no longer just an observation, but a taste on the back of her tongue. The dripping seemed louder, the groaning of the station more intimate. The observer was gone. Aris had turned a corner up ahead, his form just a fleeting shadow in the gloom. Forcing her muscles to obey, Vespera pushed off the bulkhead and moved forward, her clean white uniform a beacon of defiance in the encroaching dark. She was a traitor now, and this was the land of traitors. She quickened her pace, the sound of her footsteps echoing unnaturally in the cathedral of rust, chasing a madman into the heart of the wound. The air in the rust gardens was a physical weight. It pressed down with the suffocating humidity of a dying jungle, thick with the cloying sweetness of organic decay and the sharp metallic tang of corrosion. Aris Thorn felt it coat his tongue, a taste like old blood and rust. Every breath was a conscious effort, a foul soup he had to force into lungs accustomed to the sterile, recycled atmosphere of the Viridia spire. Here, in the station's neglected gut, Aethelgard was actively trying to digest itself.
He moved through canyons of debris, mountains of discarded tech and skeletal infrastructure that rose like petrified titans into the perpetual gloom. The primary lighting was long dead. His only guide was the weak glow of his datapad and the unsettling ethereal luminescence of bioluminescent fungi that grew in vibrant, sickly blue and green patches across the damp metal. The constant, rhythmic drip of condensation was a maddening metronome counting down his sanity, punctuated by the distant, echoing clang of an automated maintenance drone performing some forgotten, pointless task. He felt watched. It wasn't just the paranoia of a man far from his sterile, predictable world. It was a primal certainty. In a place like this, survival depended on seeing before you were seen. The rumor that had brought him here felt thin, insubstantial, a ghost of a whisper in the station's data stream. Haraldar Brecker, a dreg, a scavenger who supposedly salvaged a data chip from the Ossuary suppression team, the same team that had pacified the resonance event, the same event where Aris had seen his wife's face, a perfect, agonizing echo of memory, before Vespera Lyrian and her blank-faced enforcers had snuffed it out like a candle. That memory was the splinter in his mind, driving him forward, pushing him through this filth and fear. He checked the datapad again. The map was a crude schematic, traded for a week's worth of protein rations on the black market. It led him to a section of wall where a colossal decommissioned atmospheric recycler sat half-swallowed by junk. A jagged opening, like a wound, had been cut into its side. From within, a single, naked thermic bulb sputtered, casting a weak, jaundiced light and throwing long, dancing shadows that made the heaps of scrap seem to breathe. This was it, Haraldar's workshop, his den.
For a moment, Aris hesitated at the threshold, the foul air of the gardens mixing with a new scent from within. Hot metal, ozone, and something acrid like burnt power conduits. This was a place of work, a place of function, a place of violence. He could still turn back, retreat to the relative safety of his lab and pretend the echo of Lyra was a hallucination, pretend the architects were benevolent custodians of order, pretend his entire life hadn't already collapsed into a waking nightmare. But the memory of Lyra's face, clear as day and then gone, was more real than the station around him. He couldn't unsee it. He took a shallow, steadying breath and stepped through the jagged opening, his boots crunching on loose screws and metal shavings. The inside was a hoarder's nightmare, a scavenger's paradise. Tools, both recognizable and crudely fabricated, hung from magnetic racks. Piles of salvaged components were sorted into rusted bins. A workbench was littered with the guts of a disabled drone, its optical sensors staring blankly at the ceiling. It was chaos, but it was an organized chaos, the den of a creature who knew the precise location of every single piece of his domain. He felt the change in the air before he heard it, a subtle shift in pressure, a displacement of the thick humidity. The shadows in the deepest corner of the workshop were no longer still. He knew he had seconds. "Heralder Brecker," Aris called out, his voice sounding thin and academic in the oppressive space. He raised his hand slightly, palms out. "I'm not with the architects." The response was not a voice, but an explosion of motion. A mountain of scrap metal to his left crashed to the floor as a figure burst from the darkness behind it. He was a wall of a man, broad-shouldered and solid, dressed in the patched-together, oil-stained fatigues of a dreg. His face was a roadmap of hard living, a scar bisecting one eyebrow, his skin weathered and tough. But Aris's attention was locked on the thing in his hand.
It wasn't a standard-issue weapon. It was a heavy-duty industrial rivet gun, brutally modified. Thick power cables snaked from its body to a humming, overcharged battery pack strapped to the man's hip. The front assembly had been sharpened and reinforced, and the tip of a thick metal spike protruded from the muzzle, glowing with a faint, angry heat. The high-pitched whine of its capacitor charging was the only sound in the room, a promise of brutal, instantaneous force. The man, Heraldar, leveled the weapon, its heated tip aimed directly at Aris's sternum. His eyes, set deep in that hardened face, were chips of ice. They held no curiosity, no surprise, only a cold, predatory assessment. This wasn't a conversation. It was a predator cornering prey. Aris froze, the carefully constructed words of diplomacy evaporating in a flood of pure primal fear. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the hum of the weapon. He could feel the heat from the rivet gun's tip even from a few feet away. One twitch, one wrong move, and that spike would punch through his chest, pinning him to the wall behind like a specimen. The scientist in his brain, a detached, terrified observer, noted the efficiency of the repurposed tool. The man in its sights just tried not to be sick. "Stillness upon you," Heraldar growled, the formal greeting twisted into a venomous sneer. His voice was a low rasp, like metal grinding on stone. "That's the shit you technocrats say, isn't it?" He took a step closer, the whine of the rivet gun rising in pitch. "You've got 5 seconds to tell me why a spire dweller is down here sniffing around my scrap, and why I shouldn't nail you to my door as a warning to the next one." Aris swallowed, the moisture gone from his mouth. I'm not a technocrat. Not anymore." He had to force the words out, keep them steady, show no weakness. My name is Aris Thorne. I was a xenobiologist. I'm here about the ossuary." The name and the place landed with the weight of stones. Raldar's eyes narrowed, the only part of him that moved. The weapon remained perfectly steady. Aris pressed on, his voice gaining a sliver of desperate confidence. "You saw what happened, the suppression. They dropped something. A data chip. I think you picked it."
Hrodar let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh, devoid of any humor. "Echo-lost fool. You think I'd tell you if I did? You smell of the spire, of clean water and synthesized nutrients. You think because you're not wearing an architect's robes you're not one of them? You're their spy, their pet." "No," Aris insisted, shaking his head slowly, deliberately. "They took my research, my lab. They've had me under observation for a cycle. They want me harmonized, wiped. I'm not their pet, Brecker." "I'm their next victim, just like you." The word hung in the air between them. Victim. It was a gamble, an attempt to bridge the chasm of class and experience that separated them. For a terrifying second, Aris thought it had failed. Hrodar's face hardened further, his knuckles white around the grip of the rivet gun. Then he took another slow, deliberate step forward. The hot tip of the rivet gun pressed against the fabric of Aris's jacket, right over his heart. The material began to brown and smoke, the acrid smell filling Aris's nostrils. The high-frequency whine was now a piercing shriek directly in his ear. "Everyone's a victim down here, Thorne," Hrodar whispered, his voice a lethal threat. "The only difference is who dies first. Give me one reason, one real reason I let you walk out of here instead of becoming just another piece of recycled protein." The air in the Rust Gardens was a physical presence. It was thick with the humidity of 1,000,000 sweating hydroponic trays, heavy with the cloying sweetness of nutrient paste and the sharp metallic tang of decay. It coated Aris's throat, a film of grime and desperation. He followed the labyrinthine path of corroded catwalks, his worn synth-leather boots silent on the algae-slicked grates. The only light came from the sickly green glow of bioluminescent fungi clinging to perpetually weeping pipes, and the occasional flicker of a dying emergency strip. He found the workshop tucked into a recess carved from the station's iron skeleton, a space that wasn't so much built as accumulated. A ragged synth canvas sheet served as a door. Aris pushed it aside and stepped in.
The smell intensified. Here the sweet rot was mixed with the acrid scent of ozone and hot metal. The workshop was a hoarder's den, a dragon's cave where the treasure was junk. Piles of stripped conduits, fractured data slates, and gutted servo motors leaned against the curved walls in precarious stacks. A single work lamp cast a pool of harsh yellow light on a central bench where the man he'd followed was hunched over a piece of machinery, a sonic welder whining in his hand. Hroldar Brecker didn't look up. He was a creature of this place, built from the same scrap and rust as his surroundings. His jumpsuit was stained with grease and something that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Wiry muscle coiled in his forearms as he worked. He shut off the welder, the sudden silence amplifying the rhythmic drip of condensation from the ceiling into a nearby bucket. "You're a long way from the spire, Doctor." Raldar's voice was a gravelly rasp, a sound filed sharp by bad air and cynicism. He still hadn't turned around. Aris's heart hammered against his ribs. He had been so careful. "How did you—" "You walk like you're afraid to get your shoes dirty," Raldar said, finally turning. He set the welder down with a heavy thud.
His face was a mask of hard lines and suspicion, his eyes narrowed slits in the gloom. And you smell a soap. Down here, that's a tell. He wiped a greasy hand on his thigh. State your business before I decide you're lost salvage. Aris raised his hands slowly, palms open, a gesture of peace that felt hopelessly naive in this environment. In the ossuary, after the event, I saw you at the edge of the cordon when the architect's team was leaving. You picked something up? Ralder's expression didn't change, but a new stillness came over him, the coiled tension of a predator sizing up a threat. Saw a lot of things. Saw a ghost show. Saw a bunch of whitecoats run around like headless drones. Saw you staring into a cryopod like you lost your last echo. He took a step forward, away from the workbench and its potential weapons, a deliberate choice, or a threat in itself. My memory's a little hazy on the detail.
It was a data chip, Aris pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. The air felt too thick to speak through. One of the suppression team dropped it. It was small, silver. You palmed it. He could see the moment in his mind's eye, a quick, practiced movement, the scavenger's instinct overriding all else. I'm not from security. I don't want to take it from you. I only want to know what they're hiding. Hrodar let out a short, guttural sound that might have been a laugh. It was entirely without humor. What they're hiding? He spat on the floor, a dark glob that sizzled faintly on the corroded deck plate. Kid, everyone's hiding something. The architects hide their crimes behind the great stillness. The technocrats hide their fear behind procedure. And us? He gestured around the cluttered workshop. We hide what we can find just to live another cycle. He stepped closer, invading Aris's space. The man smelled of rust and sweat and a deep, simmering anger. You want to know the truth? There's only one truth on this whole rust bucket, Doctor. You trust no one, and you die last. That's it. That's the grand unified theory of Aethelgard. Now get out of my shop. The finality in his tone was a slammed door, but Aris couldn't leave. Not now. Lyra's face, serene behind the cryogenic frost, then the echo, the wrong voice coming from her lips. This chip was a thread, and he had to pull it. That resonance event, Aris said, changing tactics. He let his hands fall to his sides. That wasn't just a ghost show. It was a signal, a pattern. There's information in it, buried in the noise. Whatever is on that chip is connected to it. I know it is. The way they reacted, the way they sanitized the scene, that was more than just cleaning up a system glitch. Patterns, information, noise, Hrodar sneered, mocking the academic words. You still think this is a laboratory, don't you? You think you can put the universe in a petri dish and understand it. Out here, there are no patterns. There's just chaos. There's the leak from the old fusion pile that gives our kids the shakes, the rationer that shorts you on protein because he can, the architect that decides your whole level needs a memory audit because someone whispered a wrong thought. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. You think your truth is gonna fix any of that? Truth is a luxury, Doctor. A spire-born delicacy, like real coffee or an hour of uninterrupted silence. Down here, we trade in things that have weight. Nutrition packs, water filters, charge cells. An encrypted architect data chip, now that has weight. That'll fetch a few hundred echoes on the black market, enough to eat well for a month. Aris felt a cold dread mix with his desperation.
He had nothing to offer this man. He had no echoes, no influence, nothing of tangible value, only his obsession. "You're right," Aris conceded, and the admission seemed to surprise Hroldar into a brief silence. "I don't have anything to offer you. No money, no protection." "But you're wrong about the chip. You think it's valuable now, but you don't know what you have. Architect encryption isn't something your back-alley slicers can crack. They'll strip the casing for rare metals and wipe the crystal. You'll get maybe 50 echoes for the raw materials." Aris took a breath, letting his own area of expertise become his only currency. "But I can open it. I spent 15 years designing neural interface software. Their encryption architecture is a dialect of my own work. I can get inside. I can see what's on it. I can tell you what it's really worth." Hroldar stared at him, his gaze sharp, analytical. He was no longer looking at a naive academic. He was looking at a potentially valuable tool. The hostility in his eyes didn't vanish, but it was joined by a flicker of cold calculation. "And why would you do that for me?" Hroldar asked, the question a new kind of test. "Because I don't care about the money," Aris said, and the raw honesty of it seemed to hang in the humid air. "I need to know what's on it. I need to understand why this is happening. I'll break the encryption. I'll tell you everything it says. The data, the access it might grant, any monetary value it has, it's all yours. I just want the information." The workshop was silent again, save for the drip, drip, drip of water. It was the sound of a clock ticking. Hroldar's gaze flickered from Aris's face to the cluttered piles of scrap, as if weighing the scientist's strange proposal against the tangible reality of his world.
Finally, he grunted. You do it here, in my sight. You try anything, I feed your skull to the metal grinders." He turned and walked back to his workbench, rummaging under a pile of dirty rags. He produced the chip. It was exactly as Aris remembered, a small, silver rectangle, humming with a faint internal light. Hroldar didn't hand it over. He tossed it onto the bench, where it skidded across the greasy surface and stopped inches from a humming power conduit. "There's your truth, Doctor," Hroldar rasped, picking up a heavy wrench that looked like it could crack plasteel or bone. "Let's see if it's worth a damn." The ozone tang of an active plasma cutter sharpened the air, a clean electric sting against the workshop's usual fug of corrosion and mildew. It did little to cut through the thickness of Aris's fear. The weapon in Hroldar Brecker's hand was a monstrosity of scavenged parts, a magnetic clamp welded to a high-capacity power cell, its business end humming with a malevolent blue light. It wasn't a gun. It was a tool of disassembly, and it was aimed directly at Aris's chest. "I'm not one of them," Aris said, his voice straining for a reason that felt pathetic even to him. His hands were raised, palms open, a gesture of peace that felt absurd in the rust gardens. "I'm a biologist. My work, it was in the ossuary." Hroldar's grimy face twisted into a sneer. A deep scar, pale and slick against the dirt, pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent scowl. "Oh, a biologist. That makes it all better. I find things, Doc. That's what I do. And the things I find, I keep, especially when they fall off a spook's belt after they've turned some poor, echo-lost soul into static." He gestured vaguely with the buzzing tool. "Now you show up, asking for it by name. You do the math." The math was simple. It added up to Aris looking like an architect's hound. His own obsession had led him here, following the faintest trail of a rumor, a whisper of a data chip lost during a resonance suppression. A chance to see what they were hiding, a chance to understand what Lyra was becoming. Now that same obsession had him cornered by a cynical scavenger who saw conspiracy in every shadow. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat.
"The name on that chip, the project designation. It's from my expedition," Aris pleaded, taking a half-step forward. The blue hum of the cutter intensified, and he froze. "The one where my wife... the one where she died. I just need to see it. I need to know why her memory is tangled up in this." Hroldar's eyes, small and hard like rusted ball bearings, narrowed. For a fleeting second, a flicker of something other than suspicion crossed his face. It wasn't sympathy. It was the weariness of a man who had heard 1,000 sad stories on Aethelgard and knew they all ended the same way. "Everyone's got a ghost, Doc. Don't make you special." There was a sound. Not the rhythmic drip of condensation from the vaulted ceiling, or the groan of stressed metal. It was a soft, deliberate scrape of fabric against oxidized steel. It came from above. Both men looked up. The workshop was a cavern of forgotten things, a cathedral of junk. Gantries and service catwalks formed a web of black iron in the gloom far above, lost in the shadows between the sputtering glow of emergency lights. For a moment there was nothing. Then a shadow detached itself from other shadows. It fell. It wasn't a panicked fall, but a controlled descent, a fluid drop of some 20 feet that ended in a near-silent landing on the grated floor behind Hroldar. The figure rose from a crouch with an unnerving economy of motion. It was a woman, clad in the severe charcoal-gray uniform of the Architects of Silence. The fabric absorbed the dim light, and the silver sigil on her collar, a stylized eye closed, seemed to glow with its own cold energy. Her face was a pale oval, perfectly composed, her expression a blank slate of professional calm. In her hand, a sleek polymer sidearm was already leveled, its targeting laser a pinprick of crimson light dancing between the two of them. It was Vespera Lyrian, the technician from the Ossuary, the one who oversaw the suppressions, the one who watched as the echoes were silenced. Aris's blood ran cold. It was over. He hadn't been clever. He'd been tracked. A mouse followed by an owl, so preoccupied with the bait that it never thought to look up. All his desperate hope, the frantic energy that had propelled him through the station's decaying guts, evaporated into a sick, hollow dread. Harmonization, that's what came next. The clean, sterile erasure of self. Hroldar reacted instantly, his survival instincts honed to a razor's edge. He spun, his improvised weapon swinging around to face the new threat, its low-frequency hum now a snarling buzz. His eyes darted from Vespera's impassive face to Aris's stunned expression, and the final piece of his paranoid equation clicked into place. His lips peeled back from his teeth. "Well, well," he spat, the words thick with contempt. "Brought your keeper, did you, Doc? The biologist needed a little chat, is that it?" He jabbed the cutter in Aris's direction. "Ha! Shoulda known. No one comes down to the gardens alone." "He is not with me," Vespera's voice cut through the tension. It was as crisp and sterile as the air in a laboratory, devoid of inflection. "He is a complication. Same of you." Her gaze settled on Aris. There was no recognition in it, no hint that she'd seen him before in the observation domes of the ossuary. To her, he was merely a variable to be neutralized, a problem to be solved. "On behalf of the Architects of Silence," she stated, the words of formal recitation, "you will both stand down. The scavenger will relinquish the unsanctioned weapon. Dr. Thorne will cease his unauthorized investigation. The data chip will be returned to its designated custodians. Designated custodians, Aris thought, a wave of nauseating clarity washing over him. Not owners, not creators, custodians, as if they were merely minding it. The chip felt more important, more dangerous than ever before. A truth so volatile it needed guards, not just owners. "And if we don't?" Hroldar challenged, his knuckles white where he gripped his weapon. He shifted his weight, planting his feet on the greasy floor. He was cornered, and that made him infinitely more dangerous. "Non-compliance is a regrettable outcome," Vespera said, her tone unchanged. "It necessitates a more permanent form of harmonization. Dr. Thorne, you understand the protocols. Do not force this." She took a measured step forward, her weapon rock steady. The red dot slid from Hroldar's chest to the power cell of his cutter, a calculated threat. She could disable his weapon, and him along with it, with a single, precise shot. Aris felt his pulse hammering in his ears, a frantic drumbeat against the station's ever-present hum. This was it, the end of the line. He'd gambled everything on a ghost and lost to the machine.
"Just give her the chip," Aris said, his voice barely a whisper. The words tasted like ash. It wasn't about surrender. It was about survival, about living to fight another day, even if that day started with his memory wiped clean. Hreldar shot him a look of pure loathing. "You first, spook!" Suddenly, the air in the workshop changed. The low hum of the station's life support, a sound so constant it was usually just a texture of silence, dipped and wavered. The flickering lights overhead buzzed erratically, their golden-gray glow stuttering. A deep, resonant tone, like a colossal bell struck miles away, vibrated through the metal deck plates beneath their feet. A resonance echo. But this was different, stronger. It wasn't a localized whisper in the ossuary. It felt like the entire station was screaming. Vespera's composure finally cracked. A micro-expression, a brief tightening around her eyes betrayed her surprise. Her gaze flicked upwards, toward the source of the station's main conduits. This was not part of her plan. This was a new variable. With her attention momentarily diverted, she reached for her collar with her free hand, her thumb pressing the closed-eye sigil. It was a silent alarm, Aris knew, a call for reinforcements. But the station's decay had a cruel sense of humor. Instead of a silent ping to an architect command center, her signal must have been corrupted, rerouted through the station's ancient failing emergency systems. A klaxon blared to life. Not a localized alarm, but a station-wide alert, a cacophonous, shrieking wail that echoed through the cavernous space, sending flocks of metal-scavenging vermin scattering from the rafters. Red lights began to strobe, plunging the workshop into a hellish rhythm of crimson and shadow. The tense, quiet standoff shattered into pure, screaming chaos.
"The data chip, scavenger," she said, her voice as calm and recycled as the station's water. "Give it to me, and your neural harmonization will be routine, an administrative correction." Beside a workbench piled high with strict conduits and dead processors, Hroldar Brecker laughed. It was a dry, grating sound, like metal scraping against stone. He held a heavy, magnetized wrench, not like a weapon, but like an extension of his own gnarled hand. "Routine," he spat. "You mean you'll scoop out the last 10 hours and leave a nice neat hole where my memory used to be? Thanks, but I think I'll keep my thoughts, corrupted as they are." My own hands were raised, a useless gesture of peace. I was positioned between them. the unwilling fulcrum in this standoff. Vespera, please. That data could explain what's happening. Resonance isn't a glitch, it's something else. Something that needs to be understood, not erased. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, shifted to me. There was no malice in them, only a profound, chilling certainty. Dr. Thorne, your curiosity is a documented pathology. The great stillness is not a subject for debate. It is the principle of our survival. Unsanctioned memory is the disease. We are the cure. The disruptor didn't waver. Now, the chip. My mouth opened to argue, to plead, to explain the impossible hope that resonance represented, the hope of Lyra. But the words never formed. The overhead light panel, a long strip of flickering, jaundiced neon, buzzed violently and then blinked out. For a single heart-stopping second, the workshop was plunged into absolute, suffocating blackness. The only sounds were 3 sets of lungs drawing in sharp, sudden breaths. The smell of ozone felt thicker, more aggressive. Then, with a series of hydraulic groans that echoed from deep within the station's bones, the emergency systems engaged. Strips of crimson light bled from the cornices, bathing the workshop in a hellish, monochromatic glow. Every object threw a long, distorted shadow that seemed to writhe and crawl. Vespera's pristine uniform was now the color of dried blood. Hroldar's face became a landscape of stark, deep-cut canyons. The chrome of the wrench in his hand caught the red light like a bloody blade. The standoff was still there. The gun, the wrench, the space between us. But it felt distant, theatrical. A play interrupted by the theater itself catching fire. Vespera's perfect composure had finally cracked. Just a hairline fracture, a slight widening of her eyes, a tension in her jaw that hadn't been there a moment ago. Then came the hum. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a vibration that started in the soles of my worn boots, a deep bass thrum that resonated up through my shins and settled in my teeth. It was the feeling of a colossal engine coming to life somewhere beneath us, in the station's forbidden, forgotten heart. The deck plating vibrated with a low, constant thrumming that made the loose tools on Hroldar's benches rattle softly, a chorus of metallic chattering. My gaze shot to Vespera. Her hand, the one holding the disruptor, was trembling. Not from fear, I thought, but like a compass needle near a powerful magnet. She was sensitive to this. Her architect implants were picking up the signal far more purely than my own damaged ones. And then the air began to speak. It started as a faint crackle, the sound of static on a dead channel. But it grew, swelling to fill the space around us. It wasn't one voice, it was a legion, hundreds, maybe thousands of overlapping, distorted whispers, each one a fragment of a thought, a sliver of a word, a ghost of an emotion. They pressed in from all sides, a tapestry of sonic decay. They were unintelligible, yet they felt hungry. "What is this?" Hroldar's voice was a low growl, his cynical bravado dissolving into raw, primal unease. He took a half-step back, closer to the wall, his eyes darting into the newly animated shadows. I felt a cold dread snake up my spine. This was resonance, but not like I had ever experienced it. This wasn't a localized echo, a single ghost in a single machine. This was a wave, a flood, a station-wide surge of consciousness bleeding through the walls. My own neural implant throbbed in time with the hum, a dull, painful pulse behind my right eye. I fought the urge to claw at it. I thought of Lyra. Was she in there, in that cacophony? Was her voice one of the 1,000 whispers tearing at the edges of my sanity? The thought brought no comfort, only a fresh spike of terror. This didn't feel like a memory. It felt like a violation.
"This is an unscheduled cascade," Vespera said, her voice tight, forcing the clinical term through the wall of noise. But her gaze wasn't on us anymore. It was on the room, the station, the air itself. For the first time, she looked as lost as we were. The whispers intensified, coalescing into phantom syllables that almost formed words before dissolving back into static. A child's laugh cut short, an old woman's sigh, a man's angry shout, muffled as if from a great distance. A bank of scavenged monitors on Haraldar's main workbench, all previously dark, flickered to life. Not in unison, but one by one, their screens filling with a roiling sea of gray and black static. Then one screen cleared. It was the center monitor, a wide, cracked panel Haraldar had probably pulled from some decommissioned Medicaid bay. The static resolved not into a clear picture, but into a glitching, fragmented image. A face. It was a man I'd never seen before, his features gaunt and hollowed out, his skin the pallid gray of the rust garden dregs. His eyes were wide, but they weren't eyes. They were pits of roiling static. His mouth was open in a silent, pixelated scream. It was a digital ghost, a soul imprint dragged from the ossuary's cold storage and plastered onto a dead screen by a force we couldn't comprehend. He looked terrified. He looked trapped. Haraldar let out a choked gasp. That's Jorn. He worked the algae vats. Died 2 cycles ago. Coolant leak." The image held for 3 agonizing seconds, a silent portrait of digital damnation. Then, with a final violent crackle, the screen went black. The whispers in the air died with it, collapsing back into silence as suddenly as they had begun.
The air in Holdar's workshop was thick enough to chew. It was a cocktail of ozone from jury-rigged power couplings, the damp, loamy scent of algal bloom clinging to the corroded metal walls, and the sharp tang of welding flux. For Holdar, it was the smell of home. For Aris, it was the smell of a tomb still stubbornly refusing to lie down. Vespera stood stiffly near a workbench cluttered with scavenged servo motors, her pristine architect's tunic already smudged with grime. Her face was a mask of shattered composure, the disciplined stillness of her order replaced by the taut wires of someone who had seen the universe tilt on its axis. They had fled here, to the irradiated guts of Aethelgard, after the harmonization chamber had turned on them. "The subgrid will be unstable for hours," Holdar grunted, wiping grease from a diagnostic tool with a rag that only seemed to add more. "The surge you lot caused. It'll have security running in circles. We're safe enough for now." Aris wasn't listening. He was focused on a sound, a hum. It wasn't the familiar groaning symphony of the rust gardens, the chug of water purifiers, the sigh of ventilation, the distant clang of maintenance drones. This was different.
a low resonant frequency that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly in the fillings of his teeth. It was the sound of a held breath, the sound of a prelude. He felt it before he saw it, a subtle change in the pressure of his boots against the grated floor. He looked down. The film of rust and metal filings near his feet was shivering, dancing in place. "Do you feel that?" Aris asked, his voice low. Vespera finally moved, her head tilting. "A power fluctuation. The reactor leaks are getting worse. It creates inconsistencies." "No," Aris insisted. The hum was climbing the scale, moving from a bass rumble to a dissonant baritone. It made the hairs on his arms stand up. "This isn't the reactor." A spanner, resting on the edge of a stack of power cells, levitated. It rose a few inches, wobbling in the air like a stunned insect. Holdar froze, the rag halfway to his temple. He stared at the floating tool, his cynical disbelief warring with the evidence before his eyes. Then, with a sickening lurch, it fell, clattering loudly on the metal deck. The sensation was gone, but the silence it left behind was worse than the hum.
"Okay," Roldar breathed, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. "That's new." Suddenly, the entire workshop seemed to exhale. A wave of anti-gravity rippled through the room. Loose bolts, scraps of wiring, and pitted sheets of plasteel lifted from the floor. They hung suspended in the thick air, a cloud of derelict constellations. Dust motes swirled in lazy, impossible galaxies illuminated by the single flickering worklight. It was morbidly beautiful, a snow globe of decay. Aris felt a strange weightlessness in his chest, a ghost of the feeling before a fall. He braced himself. "It's the resonance," he said, the words tasting like heresy and truth. "It's not just in the network anymore." Vespera's eyes were wide, darting from one floating object to another. Her technical mind was scrambling for an explanation, for a system failure or a magnetic anomaly. Anything but this. "That's impossible. Resonance is an information cascade, a data phenomenon. It can't exert physical force." As if in answer, the gravity slammed back into place with the force of a giant's fist. The cloud of junk crashed down, a percussive explosion of metal on metal. They all flinched. The hum returned, louder now, a snarling electric thrum that promised violence. And then the whispers started. Faint at first, like static on a dying comms channel, woven into the fabric of the hum. Aris squeezed his eyes shut, trying to isolate them. Impeller shell, for breach. Tellara, I can't breathe. The pressure. "What was that?" Roldan demanded, his hand instinctively going to a heavy-looking wrench on his belt. "The whispers," Aris said, his own voice unsteady. "From the chamber. They're here." High above them, nestled in the cathedral-like gloom of the workshop ceiling, a massive shape stirred. An old M7 industrial lifting crane, a relic from the station's construction. Its magnetic claw, a rust-pocked assembly of electromagnets and durasteel talons, hung inert, caked in decades of grime. A shower of blue-white sparks erupted from its main joint. The ancient machine shuddered. A grinding screech of metal on metal echoed through the space as the crane's arm began to lower, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Get back!" Roldar yelled, shoving Vespera behind a pile of salvaged hull plating.
The crane wasn't just moving, it was hunting. The arm swung not with the programmed sluggishness of machinery,
but with a predatory speed. It swept across a section of the workshop, its claw smashing through a stack of empty coolant barrels, sending them flying like tin cans. Aris scrambled backward, stumbling over a loose power conduit. He looked up at the monstrous thing, at the pulsing, erratic glow of its magnetic head. It wasn't a malfunction. Malfunctions were random. This was directed. There was an intelligence behind the chaos, a malevolent will guiding the rust and steel. The whispers grew clearer, a chorus of the dead amplified by the groaning machinery.
Then, with a final, violent spasm, the crane's arm swung directly toward their flimsy cover. Aris saw the massive claw rushing towards him, a fist of dead metal animated by dead souls. "Down!" Vespera screamed, tackling him and pulling him flat against the floor. The crane arm smashed into the support pillar just above their heads. The impact sent a shock wave through the deck. Metal shrieked and groaned. Then, with a final shower of sparks and a long, drawn-out whine, the crane's lights died. Its arm went limp, sagging to a halt just inches from them. Silence, abrupt and total. The hum was gone. The whispers had vanished. The only sounds were the drip, drip, drip of condensation from a leaky pipe, and the three of them gasping for air, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Hroldar slowly pushed himself up, his face ashen. Vespera rolled off Aris, her body trembling. Aris lay on the cold metal floor, staring at the inert crane arm, at the darkness where Lyra's voice had been. Dread had curdled into raw, undiluted panic, and now it was settling into something far worse, a horrifying certainty. Vespera looked at the dead machine, then at Aris. The last vestiges of the architect's dogma had been burned out of her eyes. "It wasn't a data cascade," she said, her voice a ragged whisper. "It was a ghost." Aris pushed himself to his elbows, the echo of his wife's voice still ringing in his skull. It wasn't a memory, it wasn't a signal, it was a lure. He looked at the devastation around them, the physical proof of the ossuary's uncontainable rage. "No," he said, his voice hollow. "It's more than that. It's learning. It's learning how to touch." The air in Hroldar's workshop was thick enough to drink, a cocktail of ozone, metallic dust, and the damp, earthy rot of the rust gardens. Bioluminescent fungi cast a sickly green-blue glow across mountains of salvaged scrap, illuminating corroded panels and tangles of fiber-optic cable like veins in a dead leviathan. Aris's head still throbbed, a phantom echo of the harmonization machine's psychic violence. Across the cramped space, Vespera stood ramrod straight, her pristine architect uniform a stark, insulting white against the grime. She looked at the chaotic horde with the barely concealed disgust of a surgeon viewing a septic wound.
Hroldar, the proprietor of this metallic graveyard, ignored them both. He was rustling with the controls of a massive jury-rigged gantry crane, its rusted arm groaning as it lifted a colossal block of pitted plasteel, probably scavenged shielding from the decommissioned reactor below. "This is what we need," the scavenger grunted, his voice a low gravel. "Enough density to block their scans. We can build a Faraday cage, a dead zone, a place to think without them listening." "A place to die of tetanus, you mean," the sparrow muttered, her arms crossed tight. "This collection is a biohazard. The power conduits are unshielded, the structural integrity is non-existent." "It works," Hroldar shot back, not looking at her. "Which is more than I can say for your fancy architect tech right now, isn't it?" Aris flinched. The scavenger wasn't wrong. The harmonization chamber, the ultimate tool of the architect's control, had been turned against them, against Vespera. The echo of Lyra, wearing the voice of Vespera's grandfather, had broken something fundamental in her. It had broken something in him, too. The hope that Lyra's return was a pure scientific miracle was corroding into a darker, more terrifying possibility, that she was a puppet, that they all were. He felt it then, a familiar, unsettling thrum that had nothing to do with the groaning crane motor. It was a subtle pressure behind his eyes, a rhythmic hum at the edge of hearing, a ghost in the station's power grid. Resonance. Here in this scrap heap, it pulsed in time with the flickering emergency lights overhead. A slow, anemic beat. Lub-dub. Lub-dub. Suddenly, a high-pitched whine cut through the workshop's cacophony. The lights on Hodar's control panel flickered wildly. The crane's motor sputtered, its groan deepening into a shriek of stressed metal. "What was that?" Vespera asked, her composed facade finally cracking, her eyes snapping to the crane. Rodar slammed a fist against the console. "Echo-lost junk. The magnetic lock is failing." High above them, 4 circular electromagnets glowed an angry red. The multi-ton block of plasteel they held shuddered, slipping a few centimeters with a deafening screech of metal on metal. Dust and rust flakes rained down. "Turn it off!" Aris yelled. "I can't," Rodar barreled back, frantically flipping switches that did nothing. "The console is fried. The power feed is unstable."
The block slipped again, tilting at a dangerous angle. It was directly above the small, clear patch of floor where they stood, where they had been arguing seconds before. Panic seized Aris's throat, cold and sharp. The space was too cluttered. There was nowhere to run. But as he stared at the flickering magnetic clamps, he saw it. A faint, ethereal blue light pulsed around the power cables leading to the crane arm, a visual overlay his implant sometimes rendered during resonance events. The flickering wasn't random, it was a rhythm. The same slow, sick heartbeat he'd felt moments before. The resonance wasn't just an echo in the ossuary. It was a parasitic current, an active force infesting the station's decaying nervous system. It was actively pulling the machine apart. Another groan. The block dropped a full meter, held now by only 2 of the 4 magnets. The floor plates beneath their feet vibrated from the strain. "We're going to be crushed," Vespera said, her voice a tight, controlled whisper that betrayed absolute terror. "Not yet!" Rodar roared. He abandoned the dead console and pointed to a filthy, wall-mounted junction box, thick with grease and makeshift wiring. A heavy, rust-red lever stuck out of it. "The manual conduit. It can divert the power feed to the arm's rotation motors instead of the clamp." "Divert it where? That's a Class G power junction," Vespera countered, her training kicking in, overriding her fear. "If you just shunt the load without regulating the flow, you'll blow the circuit and it'll drop anyway." "You got a better idea, architect?" She didn't answer. Her eyes darted from the falling block to a smaller secondary power node nearby, its casing cracked, revealing a series of color-coded thermal regulators. Her mind was working, processing, finding the pattern in the chaos that she understood, the pattern of systems and schematics. Aris, meanwhile, was watching a different pattern, the pulsing of the resonance. Lub-dub. Lub-dub. It was growing stronger, faster. The entity in the machine was enjoying this. He could feel another surge building, another psychic spasm that would convulse the station's power grid. The last one had fried Crodar's console. The next one would release the block. Unless...
"Vespera," Aris said, his voice urgent, "can you create a bottleneck, just for a second? Overload that secondary node to draw power right before it hits the crane." She looked at him, her face pale in the eerie light. "It would create a microsurge, a power spike. It might fuse the arm's motor entirely." "Why?" "Just do it!" Hroldar yelled, his hands already on the massive lever of the manual conduit. "We have seconds!" The block gave another terrible lurch, groaning like a dying beast. Aris focused on the thrumming in his skull, on the ghostly blue light he saw crawling through the wires. The pulse was coming. A wave of dissonant energy, building to a crest. If Hroldar pulled the lever and Vespera shunted the power at the wrong moment, they would be fighting the surge. But if they timed it perfectly, they could ride it. "Hroldar, get ready," Aris commanded, his voice gaining a strange authority. He turned to Vespera, who was already ripping the cover from the secondary node, her fingers moving with deft, practiced precision. She was a traitor to her order, standing in a heap of filth, but in that moment she was still an architect, a master of the systems that were now killing them. "On my mark," Aris said. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the rhythm. The lub-dub quickened, becoming a frantic, accelerating drumbeat in his mind. He saw Lyra's face distorted, her mouth open in a silent scream. He felt the cold touch of the alien consciousness behind her eyes. It was here. It was now. He felt the peak of the wave, the precipice of the surge. Wait for the surge. Now! In a single, impossible moment of synchronicity, they moved. Vespera slammed a salvaged crowbar across two regulators, creating a brilliant shower of white sparks. Hroldar threw his entire body weight onto the massive conduit lever, screaming with effort as it scraped downwards. Aris felt the resonance wave crash through the workshop, a psychic shock wave that made his teeth ache. The crane didn't just release its burden. The surge of diverted power, amplified by the resonance pulse, hit the rotational motors. With a sound like a titan's spine snapping, the entire gantry arm twisted violently to the side. The remaining magnetic clamps died, and the plasteel block dropped. But it didn't fall on them.
It fell sideways, crashing through a mountain of scrap metal with an apocalyptic roar that shook the entire level. It smashed into the far wall, punching a hole clean through the corroded metal into the dripping darkness of the maintenance corridor beyond. The sound echoed, then faded, replaced by the tinkle of falling debris and the frantic hiss of a severed coolant pipe. And then silence. Just the three of them, frozen in a tableau of desperate action, breathing heavily in a cloud of dust and ozone. Hroldar slowly let go of the lever, his knuckles white. Vespera stared at the crowbar in her hand, then let it drop with a clang. Aris opened his eyes, the ghost light of the resonance fading from the wires. They had survived. A scavenger, a disgraced scientist, and a traitorous architect. 3 dissonant notes, forced by circumstance to play a single, desperate chord. Hroldar looked from Aris to Vespera, then at the gaping hole in his wall. A slow, grudging smile touched his lips. "Huh," he grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. Not bad. For a couple of echo-lost void-born." The truce wouldn't last. The distrust was a chasm between them. But in the ringing silence of the ruined workshop, a fragile, terrifying foundation had been laid. The air in Hroldar's workshop was thick enough to chew. It was a cocktail of scents Aris's mind struggled to catalog. The damp, organic rot of algae-choked hydroponics, the acrid tang of ozone still clinging to his clothes from the harmonization chamber's death, and beneath it all, the coppery-sweet perfume of rust. It was the smell of Aethelgard's slow, inevitable decay, a world away from the sterile, formaldehyde-laced stillness of the ossuary. He stood amidst a hoarder's paradise of scavenged tech,
Stacks of inert data slates formed teetering mesas, and the disemboweled guts of maintenance drones lay sprawled across workbenches like metallic viscera. Bioluminescent fungi, cultivated in cracked specimen jars, cast a ghostly blue-green light that did little to push back the oppressive shadows. Here, in the heart of the rust gardens, everything was either broken or repurposed, including, it seemed, the three of them. Vespera's words still hung in the humid air, as sharp and fragile as a shard of stained glass. "We are going to steal it."
Troldar let out a short bark-like laugh, a sound like gravel scraping against steel. "Steal it. Stillness upon you, architect. You just went from 0 to echo-lost in 5 seconds flat. The foundational archive isn't a data chip you can just pocket. It's a ghost story, a myth buried in the station's guts." Vespera's face, illuminated by the sickly fungal glow, was a mask of furious certainty. The pristine composure of her order had been sandblasted away, leaving only raw nerve and terror. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of a workbench. "I've seen the schematics, Scavenger. The sub-level access points. It's no myth," she snapped, her voice tight, brittle. "And everything I was taught, everything I enforced, is a lie. That machine wasn't just malfunctioning, it was listening. It used her," she gestured at Aris, a sharp, angry jab, "to get to me." The name echoed in Aris's skull, a dissonant chord in the symphony of his grief. Kalen. "Kalen," he said, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. He looked at Vespera, not as an ally, but as another piece of a horrifying puzzle. That name, why did it use that name? Who was he? His own obsession felt cold now, clinical. The hope that resonance was a path to Lyra, a way to reclaim her, had curdled. What if it wasn't a miracle? What if it was a violation? A parasite wearing the faces of the dead like a series of masks, and he was just the fool trying to kiss one. Before Vespera could answer, a new sound intruded. A low, resonant groan, so deep it seemed to come from the station's very bones. It was the sound of immense weight shifting, of ancient, tired metal complaining. Hroldar froze, his head cocked. His cynicism vanished, replaced by the honed instinct of a creature who survived by listening to the whispers of a dying habitat. "What was that?" Vespera asked, her eyes darting towards the workshop's main entrance, a heavy, reinforced blast door Hroldar had sealed behind them. "Be quiet," Hroldar commanded. The groaning intensified, climbing in pitch to a drawn-out, agonizing shriek of tortured steel. The stacks of data slates vibrated, and a fine red dust of rust drifted down from the ceiling. The bioluminescent jars flickered, as if in a sudden wind. "Back!" Hroldar yelled, shoving Vespera and Aris away from the center of the room. "Get back, now!" The shriek became a deafening, tearing roar. Aris felt a tremor run up through the soles of his boots, a violent shudder that vibrated in his teeth. He stumbled, catching himself on a pile of salvaged conduits. For a terrifying second, the floor beneath him heaved, throwing him to his knees. Then came the impact. It wasn't a crash. It was an apocalypse in miniature. A sound so colossal, it bypassed his ears and detonated directly in his sternum. The world became a concussion of noise and force. The blast door didn't buckle, it screamed, bent inward like paper, and then vanished behind a concussive wave of air and debris. The entire workshop plunged into absolute roaring darkness as the main power lines above them snapped with a series of percussive cracks. Aris was thrown sideways. Metal shrieked, glass shattered. The air became a choking storm of dust and rust, filling his lungs, his mouth, his eyes. He felt a rain of smaller objects clatter down around him. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Silence. A profound, ringing silence that was more terrifying than the noise had been. The constant, low-frequency hum of Æthelgard's life support, the soundtrack to his entire existence on the station, was gone. The only sound was the frantic pounding of his own heart and the ragged, desperate sound of 3 people gasping for air in a cloud of filth. A few seconds later, emergency power flickered on. A single bare bulb overhead sputtered to life, casting the room in a bloody, pulsating red light. The air was a thick, unbreathable haze of particulates. Aris coughed, pushing himself up. His hands came away from the floor coated in a gritty red paste. Vespera was on the ground a few feet away, her pale hair dusted with rust, her face a smudge of shock. Hroldar was already on his feet, a dark silhouette against the swirling dust, moving toward the demolished entrance. The resonance hum, the phantom signal that had hijacked their minds and started this chain of events, was gone. The psychic storm had passed, leaving behind purely physical wreckage. Hroldar stood before the ruin of his doorway for a long, silent moment. The red emergency light glinted off the new wall that had not been there a minute before. A tangled, mountainous mass of sheared girders, thick cables, and crumpled plating filled the entire entryway from floor to ceiling. It was a solid, impassable barricade of industrial carnage.
"What is it?" Vespera asked, her voice hoarse. Hroldar didn't turn. He placed a hand on a twisted beam of metal, as if taking the pulse of the disaster. "It's our exit," he said, his voice flat, devoid of its earlier sarcasm. It was the voice of a man stating an incontrovertible terminal fact. Or it was. That was the main cargo crane from 3 levels up. Looks like the power surge from your little harmonizer stunt finally fried its magnetic anchors. He finally turned, his face half in shadow, half in the pulsing red glare. He looked from Vespera's terrified expression to Aris. There was no "I told you so" in his eyes. There was something worse. Resignation. Aris pushed himself fully to his feet, his gaze going past the scavenger to the mangled tombstone blocking their path. Tons of twisted metal, a monument to their disastrous flight. The faint, sweet smell of superheated steel now mixed with the ever-present decay. Vespera had proposed they steal a memory. Hroldar had offered them a hiding place. The station itself had just offered its rebuttal. They were alive, they were together, and they were utterly trapped. We hadn't just found a common enemy, Aris thought, the dust grinding between his teeth. We had built our own prison.